The night sky over Tokyo was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the impending storm soon to be unleashed. It was March 9, 1945, and the island nation of Japan, with its judgment clouded by pride and ancient traditions, continued to defy the Allies and refuse to surrender. Little did they know that a dark armada of B-29 Superfortress bombers were about to strike the very heart of their capital city, their bellies brimming with over 500,000 incendiary bombs. Even worse, it would be the most devastating air attack in history, the night of the Black Snow in Tokyo. As the engines of the bombers roared in the distance, drawing ever closer, the citizens of Tokyo remained oblivious to the approaching danger. The city's air raid sirens, which had become an all too familiar sound, remained silent. The Japanese military, stretched thin and running low on resources, had little left to defend against the imminent onslaught. The mission, codenamed Operation Meeting House, marked a significant shift in American tactics. For months, the United States had conducted precision strikes on military targets within Japan, but the results were unsatisfactory. Now they were about to unleash a new kind of hell. A devastating firebombing campaign that would leave an indelible scar on the nation's psyche and forever change the course of the war in the Pacific. As the first incendiaries began to fall from the sky, the stage was set for a night of unimaginable horror and destruction. The night of the Black Snow was about to begin. And by the time the sun rose on the smoldering ruins of Tokyo, the world would bear witness to the most devastating air attack in human history. The road to the Tokyo firebombing began on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, when the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The date was December 7, 1941. And the attack left the United States reeling in shock. In a matter of hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 18 ships, destroyed over 300 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 Americans. The shock and anger that followed Pearl Harbor galvanized the American people and their leaders. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared that the attack was a date which will live in infamy, and vowed that the United States would never forget the horror. The nation was determined to get its revenge on Japan. But the challenges were immense. Japan's position in the Pacific was strategic, bolstered by its island bases and formidable navy. This made direct retaliation difficult. American military planners knew they needed a bold and unconventional approach. The result was the Doolittle Raid, a daring mission that would bring the war to Japan's doorstep. On April 18, 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers took off from the deck of the USS Hornet, an aircraft carrier positioned off the coast of Japan. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle, the bombers struck targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya before heading for China, where they hoped to land and eventually make their way back to friendly territory. The Doolittle Raid was a stunning psychological blow to the Japanese, who had believed their homeland was invulnerable. The attack also provided a much-needed boost to American morale. However, the raid had unintended consequences. Stung by the humiliation, the Japanese military became even more aggressive in its conquest of the Pacific, leading to the pivotal Battle of Midway in June 1942. As the war raged on, American engineers were hard at work developing a new bomber that could strike at the heart of Japan from bases in China. The result was the B-29 Superfortress, a technological marvel that could carry a heavier bomb load and fly higher and faster than any other bomber in the world. To bring the B-29s within range of Japan, the United States launched a massive campaign to capture the Mariana Islands, a chain of strategic outposts in the Central Pacific. The battles for Saipan, Tinian and Guam were among the bloodiest of the war. But by the summer of 1944, the islands were in American hands. With the Marianas secured, the stage was set for a new phase of the air war against Japan. The B-29s were now within striking distance of Tokyo, and American military planners were eager to unleash their devastating potential. Little did they know that their new tactics would lead to one of the darkest chapters in the history of warfare, a night that would forever be remembered as the Night of the Black Snow. As the B-29s began to take off from their bases in the Marianas, loaded with thousands of incendiary bombs, the people of Tokyo could only wait and wonder what horrors the night would bring. The approaching drone of the bombers' engines was a chilling reminder that the war was about to take a terrifying turn, one that would test the limits of human endurance and leave a lasting scar on the soul of a nation. As the war in the Pacific entered its fourth year, American military planners were growing increasingly frustrated with the failure of their precision bombing raids on Japan. Despite the technological superiority of the B-29 Superfortress, the bombers were struggling to inflict significant damage on Japan's industrial infrastructure. The challenges were numerous. The high-altitude winds over Japan, known as the jet stream, played havoc with the bombers' accuracy, and the country's dispersed and well-camouflaged factories were difficult to target. Moreover, Japan's air defenses, while not as formidable as those of Germany, were still capable of inflicting heavy losses on the American bombers. As the raids continued to produce disappointing results, pressure was mounting on the U.S. Army Air Forces to find a new approach. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his military advisors were growing impatient with the lack of progress, and there were fears that the war in the Pacific could drag on for years if a decisive blow was not struck soon. Someone had to make a move, and Major General Curtis LeMay was that man. A brilliant but ruthless air commander who had made a name for himself by developing innovative bombing tactics in Europe, LeMay was appointed to lead the 21 Bomber Command in the Marianas, and he wasted no time in shaking things up. For starters, LeMay was quick to study the Allied bombing campaign in Europe, particularly the devastating raids on Hamburg and Dresden. He noted that the most effective attacks had been those that targeted densely populated urban areas with incendiary bombs, creating massive firestorms that consumed everything in their path. General LeMay believed that a similar approach could work in Japan, where many cities were built largely of wood and paper. He easily spotted that the Japanese urban centers were uniquely vulnerable to fire. Their narrow streets, densely packed buildings, and limited firefighting capabilities branded Japan as a perfect target for such destruction. Armed with this knowledge, LeMay began to plan a new kind of bombing campaign, one that would target Japan's cities with overwhelming force. He ordered his bombers to be stripped of their defensive armament, allowing them to carry even more incendiary bombs, and he instructed his pilots to fly at lower altitudes to improve their accuracy. The projections were sobering. Military planners estimated that a series of incendiary raids on Japan's 6 largest cities could destroy nearly 40% of the country's total industrial capacity, equivalent to the loss of 7.6 million man-months of labor. It was a staggering figure, one that could potentially cripple Japan's war machine and bring the conflict to a swift end. However, LeMay and his superiors were well aware that such an attack would also result in a horrific loss of civilian life. The US had always maintained a policy of precision bombing, targeting military and industrial sites while avoiding civilian areas whenever possible. An incendiary campaign against Japan's cities would be a significant departure from that policy, and this raised profound moral and ethical concerns. Nevertheless, the military imperatives of the war took precedence. With American casualties mounting and no end in sight, US leaders were willing to engage even the most drastic measures to bring Japan to its knees. President Roosevelt himself had declared that "We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war," and LeMay's incendiary campaign was too perfect to resist. The stage was set for one of the most deadly attacks in the history of warfare as the B-29s began to assemble on the runways of the Marianas, their bomb bays laden with clusters of M69 incendiary bombs. The Japanese people, who'd already suffered years of privation and sacrifice, were about to face a new and terrifying kind of assault, one that would scorch their cities, consume their homes, and claim innocent lives in massive numbers. Yet, even as the first flames began to flicker on the streets of Tokyo, few could have imagined the sheer scale of the destruction that was about to be unleashed. The night of the Black Snow was approaching, and it would leave an indelible mark on the psyche of a nation, a searing reminder of the horrors of war. It was a normal night which held the premise of sadness. The familiar comfort of darkness enveloped the city of Tokyo and brought with it unexpected disaster. The date was the 9th of March 1945, and a war maelstrom was brewing in the shadows. The deadly Operation Meeting House air attack was being activated, and the citizens of Japan would wake up to a shock they would never recover from. From across the far-flung Mariana Islands, a formidable armada of B-29 Superfortress bombers stood ready, their cavernous bomb bays laden with clusters of M69 incendiary devices. Each of these seemingly innocuous contraptions harbored the potential to ignite an unquenchable inferno. The sheer magnitude of the operation was staggering to behold, as 279 of these aerial leviathans were positioned to take part, most bearing up to 7 tons of incendiary catastrophe. While men slept, the bombers began their ascent into the night sky, with their sights firmly set on Tokyo's Shitamachi district, a densely populated labyrinth of wooden houses and serpentine alleyways. This selected area was no coincidence. It was already mapped out by General LeMay as the perfect location to begin wreaking havoc. Once it was midnight, the vanguard of the bomber formation dispersed over the unsuspecting city. Incendiaries rained down from the heavens in their numbers, their trajectories tracing fiery arcs across the sky. As the bombs struck the earth, these seemingly simple devices, a perfect blend of napalm and white phosphorus, burst into brilliant orange flames and rapidly engulfed everything in their immediate vicinity. In the blink of an eye, the once calm night was illuminated by a lurid, pulsating glow that painted the horizon an apocalyptic hue. Best described, it was raining fire and brimstone, and there was no way to stop it. In response, Tokyo's military quickly jumped to the defense of their beloved city, but they could only do so much. The back-and-forth demands from the previous wars had stretched the soldiers, and their resources were at an all-time low. Too ill-equipped to handle the spreading inferno, they sought the firefighters, but this too was a futile attempt. Armed with little more than rudimentary buckets and hand pumps, the city's firefighters were soon overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the raging fire that now engulfed entire city blocks. The crews of anti-aircraft batteries were too blinded and disorientated by the acrid smoke and searing flames to draw a bead on the high-altitude B-29s that continued to fire at the city, whereas from their lofty vantage point, the crews of the B-29s bore witness to a scene that defied belief. The city below had been transformed into a roiling cauldron of fire, an infernal vista that seared itself indelibly into their memories. It was like staring into the gaping maw of hell itself, one visibly shaken pilot later recounted. The entire cityscape was consumed by flames, and the billowing smoke was so dense that it nearly obscured the ground from view. As the relentless deluge of bombs continued unabated, the fire spread with a terrifying, almost preternatural speed. The wooden houses that dominated the Shitamachi district were caught up in the flames. The narrow, beautiful streets that had once thrummed with the vibrant pulse of commerce and daily life now looked like death traps, choked with suffocating smoke and blistering heat. For the Japanese civilians caught in this maelstrom of fire and fury, the night rapidly descended into an unimaginable nightmare. What started as a calm night ended with tens of thousands of men, women, and children ensnared between the advancing wall of flames and the thick smoke that fanned in its wake. Some sought desperate refuge in the city's rivers and canals, only to meet an even more horrific fate as the superheated water literally boiled them alive. Others, with their lungs seared and their strength utterly spent, simply collapsed where they stood, giving in to the inferno's merciless embrace. The searing testimony of one survivor, a young woman named Akiko Takakura, vividly captures the sheer horror and desperation of that hellish night. People were hurling themselves into the canals in a frantic bid to escape the all-consuming inferno. She recalled, her voice trembling with emotion. But the water itself was boiling, and as they tried to claw their way back out, their skin sloughed off like a glove. As the conflagration raged on unchecked, temperatures at street level soared to unimaginable heights. In some of the hardest hit areas, the searing heat was so intense that it melted the asphalt underfoot, creating a grotesque tar-like morass that immobilized fleeing civilians. Even the metallic sturdy frames of buildings began to warp and deform under the inferno's relentless onslaught. But amid this mix of devastation and chaos, there emerged stirring acts of selfless heroism and indomitable human spirit. Firefighters, many of whom were untested volunteers, battled the flames with a grim determination, even as their own homes and loved ones were consumed. Ordinary citizens risked life and limb to pull the injured and the elderly from the rubble and carry them to safety through a gauntlet of smoke and fire. Yet, despite their brave efforts, the sheer scope and scale of the destruction ultimately proved too vast to overcome. By the time the first rays of dawn began to penetrate the pall of smoke that shrouded the city on March 10th, the magnitude of the tragedy had become apparent. More than 100,000 men, women, and children lay dead, their lives snuffed out by the pitiless flames. Over 1 million more were left injured and homeless, their possessions reduced to ash and cinders. Tokyo, a proud and ancient city that had endured for centuries, had been razed to the ground, transformed into a smoldering post-apocalyptic wasteland without mercy. As the shell-shocked survivors emerged from the ruins, they were confronted by a scene of unimaginable devastation. Entire neighborhoods, once vibrant and thriving, had been scoured from the map as if by the hand of an angry god. Charred rubble and twisted metal stretched as far as the eye could see, punctuated by the ghostly silhouettes of burned-out buildings. The very air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke and the sickly odor of charred human flesh. A grim and unwelcome reminder of the staggering human cost of the attack. In the days and weeks that followed, the true extent of the devastation became increasingly clear. A staggering 16 square miles of the city had been reduced to smoldering ruins, and the death toll continued to mount as more bodies were pulled from the rubble. The incendiary assault had also dealt a crippling blow to Tokyo's industrial capacity, destroying factories, warehouses, and transportation hubs that were vital to Japan's ability to continue waging war. But this is just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the aftermath of this catastrophic airstrike. There was more. As the smoke cleared over Tokyo, the true extent of the devastation wrought by Operation Meeting House became apparent. More than 100,000 people had perished in the firestorm, and 1 million more were left injured and homeless. The once vibrant city had been reduced to a smoldering wasteland, its streets choked with rubble and ash. The social fabric of Tokyo, already strained by years of war and privation, began to unravel in the wake of the attack. Survivors, many of them left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, struggled to find food, shelter, and medical care. Anger and resentment towards the government, which had failed to protect its citizens, simmered just beneath the surface. As word of the attack spread, both Japan and the United States sought to control the narrative. Japanese authorities, desperate to maintain morale, downplayed the extent of the damage and loss of life. American military leaders, meanwhile, hailed the raid as a major victory, emphasizing the destruction of Tokyo's industrial capacity while minimizing the civilian toll. Yet even as the propaganda machines churned, the morality and necessity of the incendiary assault were being debated at the highest levels of the American government. Some, including General Curtis LeMay himself, argued that the attack was a necessary evil, a means of breaking Japan's will to fight and hastening the end of the war. Others, however, saw it as a violation of the principles of just warfare, a wanton act of destruction that targeted civilians indiscriminately. For the Japanese leadership, the attack was a stunning blow, but one that only strengthened their resolve to fight on. In a statement issued after the raid, Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso declared that Japan would fight to the bitter end and vowed to crush the arrogant enemy. The government began a crash program to disperse its remaining industries, hoping to limit the impact of future raids. The respite, however, was short-lived. In the months that followed, American bombers returned to Tokyo again and again, raining down incendiaries on the already devastated city. Other Japanese cities, including Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, were also targeted, their populations subjected to the same terrible ordeal as Tokyo's. The most devastating blows, however, were yet to come. On August 6 and 9, 1945, American bombers dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing tens of thousands instantly and leaving many more to die of radiation poisoning in the weeks and months that followed. Faced with the prospect of more atomic attacks, and with the Soviet Union's declaration of war, Japan finally surrendered on August 15th. In the years that followed, the legacy of the Tokyo firebombing remained a subject of intense debate and controversy. Some, particularly in Japan, argued that the attack should be recognized as a war crime, a deliberate targeting of civilians that violated international law. Others, including many American veterans and military leaders, maintained that the raid was a legitimate military operation, a necessary step in ending a brutal and costly war. The United States government never officially apologized for the attack, nor was it recognized as a war crime. The raid is still often referred to as a strategic bombing operation, a term that critics argue downplays the human cost and moral implications of the attack. Yet, as the years have passed and as the generation that lived through the war has begun to fade away, there's been a growing recognition of the need to confront the painful legacy of the Tokyo raid. In Japan, survivors and their descendants have worked tirelessly to preserve the memory of that terrible night and to ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. The United States is not left out too, as there's been a growing awareness of the human cost of the air campaign against Japan and a willingness to grapple with the moral complexity of the war. The Tokyo raid, once celebrated as a great victory, is now more often seen as a tragedy, a reminder of the terrible toll that war exacts on the innocent and the powerless. The Night of the Black Snow stands as one of the most devastating air raids in human history, a terrible testament to the destructive power of modern warfare. The attack on Tokyo, which claimed the lives of over 100,000 civilians and left 1 million more homeless, was a stark reminder of the human cost of war and a sobering lesson in the wildness of strategic bombing. Yet, even as we recoil at the horror of that terrible night, we must also remember the courage and resilience of those who survived it. The people of Tokyo, who had endured so much suffering and loss, refused to be broken by the attack. They rebuilt their city from the ashes and went on to create a new and better future for themselves and their children. As we look back on the events of March 9th and 10th, 1945, we're reminded of the importance of memory, empathy, and the pursuit of peace. We must never forget the terrible toll of war, nor the human faces behind the statistics. We must strive to build a world where such horrors are never again visited upon the innocent, and where the voices of peace and reconciliation are stronger than the drums of war. The night of the Black Snow will forever be remembered as a tragedy, a searing reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. May its lessons never be forgotten, and may its victims never be lost to the mists of history.